I'm going to talk about type. I'm going to talk about type specifically as it relates to user experience. Because one of the things that I have found, the longer I've worked on the web, the more I have found that as the technology gets better and the screens get smaller, type becomes one of the most significant elements of user experience. But what we don't want to ignore is the fact that it actually started out defining the user experience a very long time ago. So this is a little bit of history, a little bit of talk about exactly what typography is and how that has changed in the last few years, and how the practice of typography has changed. I wrote this talk earlier this year, and then was fortunate enough to give it at DrupalCon in New Orleans, and things have continued to change since then. So that just kind of underscores the fact that even over the first the few months of this year, there have already been some pretty big shifts. So the technology changes, the practices change, the devices change, but one of the things that has remained a constant for a few thousand years is that we get our ideas across from one person to another in a written form. And the physical form of that for the last 500 or 600 years or so has been done through some form of set type. So that's our glue, and that's what we're going to look at today. This is my pal Tristan, and the reason I keep showing him off is that he and I go on a lot of journeys together. So in the morning, we go for a walk to this place. This is Turner Reservoir near my house, and we do a lot of thinking. He generally does a lot of sniffing and a lot of drinking of the water in the reservoir, but I get to do a lot of thinking while he's doing that. And I tend to kind of work through things that way. I work through how to stop ending up working with people like John Picozzi all the time, because he's been coming back for a recurring theme in my life for about 9 years. He's a good guy. I just like to pick on him, and he's sitting by himself in the front row, so he made himself a target. So I said we were going to look at the future, but it is a future that's inspired by the past, and it's something that we still have to kind of create. And so let's go forward or backward a little bit. So this goes back to late 1800s, I think. It's a bicycle company advertisement, and I think that generally speaking, if you look at this, you sort of get a feel for a time and a place, and there's a little bit of nostalgia, and there's some interesting tone that gets communicated by the typography that's been used in this. And if you have looked at any advertising or vintage posters, you get a sense of the history based on the typefaces that are used. And now the reason I put this up is that even though it was made probably 150 years ago, it still does two important things, which is the two things that any piece of design must do in order to be successful. It communicates an idea and it influences behavior. The whole point of this is to give you a sense of what it's like to own a Victor bicycle and motivate you to go buy one. Any piece of design, any piece at all, in order to be a successful piece of design, has to do those two things. Here's another example. It's another beautiful layout that really gives you the feeling of the mist coming off that cup of coffee. This influence that we want to impart is largely made up by how we design. We've got this ad from Nike where the type is actually an integral part of the layout. So it's a physical part of the form, and it is that bridge, that connecting thing between the designer and who they're representing, in this case Nike, and you, the user. So you have been brought into this piece and made a part of it by reading it and following that form all the way over to that swoosh on the right by type. That's the bridge. So it's really pretty inseparable from that experience. We can't have an experience without getting that across. Or you can, but it's a very limited one, and it's generally only conveyed by pictures of my dog. So now we're going to look at a book by Frank Camaro called The Shape of Design. And what we're seeing here is the ebook format of this. And we look forward at the web version and in mobile, and you'll see that he's done a really beautiful job of maintaining a consistent typography, but adapting it well to the context in which it's viewed. So he's done a very good job of working this way in a digital format, because that communication over these last hundreds of years has increasingly been shifting into digital forms. And that's something that's not going to slow down. It's gone from magazines and books and tabloids into tablets and phones and watches. And it's an entirely different form factor and quality of screen, but it still has to convey a message. So going further into the future, because we know that this isn't actually true, but you could have a car interface that has beautiful typography and nice scannable hierarchy, and it could convey lots of useful information. This is made up. It's a screenshot that I took from a technology demo that Monotype put out. But we have a number of cars on the market today that incorporate CarPlay from Apple or Android Auto. So I actually have a high-quality tablet screen that's embedded in the dashboard that's far better than what you'd see with most cars. And it has the quality of hardware and memory that enables them to have this high-quality rendered type and create a much stronger visual hierarchy than what you see most of the time. And we'll actually have a picture of that later. So that's a rosy future of lots of beautiful typography that does just as good a job conveying information and emotion as its physical counterparts have done. But it's not now. So material, method, and the typeface that are actually the foundation of this user experience, it's the relationship between those elements that has really shifted from a physical and a static form into a dynamic application. So now we're going to go back into history again, and we're going to look a little bit further back to a time when the medium really was the message. So let's go back a few thousand years. Now, true or not, and this is not a commentary on religion in any way, shape, or form, but the metaphor, these rules are literally set in stone. That's a pretty hefty reinforcement of just how important those 10 commandments are. There's no backspace, there's no autocorrect, there's no undo. It is literally carved in stone. 15th century prayer book from found at a monastery in Italy, and this was something that was copied laboriously by hand, really considered to be something guided by the hands of God. There was nothing more important and more beautiful than representing the Word of God to the people that were creating this. So there really was something priceless about it, and the physical form of it really reinforced the importance of the message. This comes forward a few hundred years to something that's very close to me and really has a strong place in my heart, is our family copy of The Hobbit. So it's a photograph of a copy. There's an edition that was printed somewhere in the 60s. And it's this beautiful letterpress printed book with a nice cloth hardbound cover and these illustrations that were reproduced, done by the author. And everything about the proportion and the typesetting, the smell, the physicality of it reinforces a very magical time when I was about 5 or 6 years old listening to my dad read this story to my brother and I. So that's a very close tie between how this thing was made, how it looks, how it smells, how it feels, and that message that it conveys. Is that perfect for that really intimate story about this very small person on a very big mission? Now, this is an example of where the typeface itself actually takes on the importance. This is Johnson. It was a typeface that was designed late 1800s, very early 1900s, and actually put into use 100 years ago this year as the identity for the London Underground, the London transport system. And it is still in use today. It's the longest running use of a single typeface that we know of. So they have all of this beautiful work that they've done in creating a design system, and they're very comprehensive about it, and it has taken on almost this national identity. So it really doesn't matter what color it is. You look at those shape of those letters, and it immediately says to you, you're underground. That's very powerful. Times, the Times in this case. And it is very much that Times typeface that you see on your computer that was designed for this newspaper. Again, we're going back over close to 100 years or so when this was first put into use. Now, what was amazing about this typeface is that there are all of these elements of it that are very stable. So very uniform, very symmetrical, got a broad base in the serifs there. It conveys authority. It really can, it imbues everything that you see in it at the time, in particular, with the weight of the institution behind it. But there's also something really clever about it. In the metal type, in the way that it designed, actually had these tiny little traps in it where all the strokes intersected that would pool the ink. So it was actually carved out a little bit so that they could print on this extremely cheap, low-quality paper and still have the crisp lines. So they actually designed, the technology was such that they were carving out this metal type with these little ink traps in it so that you would still get this really crisp appearance even on this cheap paper. Now, it's not to say that the UX couldn't be improved. So those clever folks down in the lower level, and well, this is a screenshot from Downton Abbey, but this was a real thing. The butler would iron the newspaper. And the reason they ironed the newspaper was that it would reduce ink transfer and make that really cheap paper a little stiffer and a little shinier. So it would feel like a higher quality product. So the combination of the way the type was designed, how it was printed, and then how it was improved actually transformed that whole experience. So, you know, the commoners would have black hands and flimsy papers, and then those that can afford it would have a slightly elevated experience. Think of it as a progressive enhancement. Maybe not so progressive if we look at it that way. So from then to now, what does that look like today? What does our world of news look like today? Well, sadly, it generally looks like this. It looks like Verdana. At least it's not Helvetica, so it's a small step. But it's probably set in 13 pixels, so slightly too small, you know, just a little bit too small to read comfortably. But this is how most of the world of news on the web looks today. One of the problems is that it has, up until very recently, been so hard to deal with the technology that nobody starts thinking about design. It's been so hard to get the content out. Think about how often newspapers need to publish, and you know, we're all familiar with Drupal, but go back 10 years and it didn't exist, or it was not in any shape that we would want to use it. And it was really not so feasible for people to have this wonderful technology so that they didn't have time to think about design and get past that really awful experience. Not to mention the fact that it's only been maybe about 5-6 years that we've been able to use nicer typefaces and have better support for typography on the web. But this isn't just on the web, it's actually across in a lot of other environments. So here we see a physical device, an app, and a web experience from a company whose products I use regularly. It's from Garmin. That is a picture of my cycling computer on the left there, the app that I use every time I ride, and then the website where I go and look at that ride data later on. And every single one of them uses a different typeface. One has very low quality rendering on the left, and then there's slightly better in the app on the right, and then something totally different again once you get to the website. That's a pretty fixable problem, but they didn't bother doing it, so they've left that experience fractured all the way across. Our car, this is a photograph of the dash in our Subaru. Raise your hand when you can tell me what time it is. All right, y'all hit the bus, never mind. Physically, the problem with car interfaces is that the electronics are so cheap, they can't really afford to put type rendering in there. So most car interfaces are constrained to 2, maybe 3 different type sizes, and they can't truncate, they can't scale, they can't do a lot of things that would help us provide the user, the driver, with a more glanceable environment. Something where they can look quickly and see the most important information. And when you're driving, one of those bits of information, like maybe what is the temperature or what time is it, is probably a little bit more important than having these sort of hardwired buttons around the edge. That's printed in plastic. This is all the type down here. And if you look carefully in your car when you get back into it, you'll probably see a lot of these same issues. So the technology has been improving, but the access of designers to be able to bring that hierarchy to life is really only just now becoming a thing. So our present is clearly far from perfect. Someone's supposed to make a grammar joke here, but I wouldn't want to make them tense. So what's changed? What is different now about the technology and what we can do to create a better user experience than what we had previously? Well, pretty much everything. So we have better technology and the ability to apply it, but we also have a fundamentally different way of thinking about how we're putting content on the screen and the relationship our design has with that content. There's a few things about that, and one of them, most centrally, is Drupal. One of the reasons that we're here today. The content, we've done all of this work to give our site owners, our clients, the tools to completely wreck our design system. Because we're going to create a design based on these really beautiful layouts that have exactly the right number of characters in the headline and exactly the right numbers of characters in that little teaser description underneath it. And those silly customers or clients are going to go in and they're going to change that headline tomorrow, and it's going to be one line on one press release, and it's going to be 4 lines of text on the next press release, and our design system is just going to go to hell if we didn't really think about it. So the content is changing. The screen size is constantly changing. We have well over 1,000 different screen sizes that we have to deal with on a daily basis that our design system has to be able to handle. So the screen size and layout is fragmented across all of these different things. The content is always changing, and the physical form factor and the mode of interaction is changing. So our rules have to change, and the way we apply them have to change. So we look at this website here. There's some interesting things going on in this design. So whether or not you think it's a really beautifully designed website kind of doesn't matter. They've thought about the hierarchy so that we know what the most important information is. In this size, you can see a very interesting relationship between the type and the profile of the guy's face. It's great at this moment in time at this screen size, but at the very least, they have thought about the way it would reflow so that it does present content, maybe in not the most tightly unified design system, but it does work. So you can still see that content, get that experience, albeit in a slightly different way, but a more appropriate one for the size and scale of the device with which someone is interacting. So we also have this notion of rendered versus dynamic. And this is, to me, the heart of it. So this came about through a conversation that I was engaged in with some other type nerds early this year. And what dawned on me was that this shift in what is typography and how we have to practice it today really comes down to, do the letters stay where you put them? And if you think about print design, you could always place a photo, place type over it, and know that that lettering was going to follow the contour of that guy's face. And it would always stay that way. And if you're designing something for film or broadcast, it doesn't matter. You actually know it's going to be rendered each screen into a fixed set of relationships. And you know that the title of that movie is not going to change, at least once it's released. So this notion of what was rendered. It was fixed. What is now is completely dynamic because that content's going to change. I'm going to turn my phone sideways and change the layout because I have a wholly different aspect ratio and width. All of those things change from a moment's notice, day to day, day in and day out. So our world is one of rules and constraints and relationships, not fixed entities. And that's something that will never go back. Any dynamic system, any website, any app, any digital product is going to be dealing with this dynamic reality. Even if you think about that car interface, I just sold it to someone who's going to take it up to Montreal. And what are they going to do? They're going to change the language setting in there. And now that interface is going to be presented in French, which thankfully has roughly the same kind of word lengths as English. So it's at least relatively close. But can you imagine that interface that truncates all of that text trying to render this in German? that is on average 40% longer than the English language, well, that interface is going to break because it can't scale the text and it can't do anything dynamic to use perhaps a narrower typeface. So all of those things that we take for granted in being able to do this in a dynamic system, we could key language and typeface actually based on a language encoding class or an attribute selector in looking at the HTML of our page. So we could call a different typeface for any different language in which our website is being displayed. So that's a pretty interesting thing to consider. It's daunting, but it's also kind of exciting because it gives us a lot of freedom to be more reactive to how people are viewing things. So consider the cover for this Emigre book. It was a compendium of a whole bunch of their typefaces, beautiful relationships between each line of type. That would never work on the web because someone would log in tomorrow and change a punctuation mark. They would do something on the web that would change all those relationships, and we wouldn't have that beautiful alignment. Credit sequence from the movie Seven. If you haven't seen it, even if you don't want to see the rest of arguably one of the better crime thrillers that you might watch, that 2 minutes of credit sequence is some of the best I've ever seen in film. It's incredible storytelling, and it has this beautiful relationship between the type and the image and the sound that is absolutely incredible, but it is totally scripted and totally fixed. It's always going to be like that. It doesn't matter if I watch that movie on my phone or a tablet or in a movie theater, those relationships will always be preserved. Same thing in broadcast. So even in television, there's a certain amount of fixedness here. It's great storytelling. It's a credit sequence from the Americans, but they also know that those relationships, the name of the actors, there will be very little change over the life of this. So they can take the time to layer text and image and graphic elements in a way that really is a beautifully told story, but will not shift. It doesn't matter on what platform you watch it. So again, this is looking at everything is rendered, it's fixed, it's not really changing. But now if we think about how this gets applied on the web, we're looking at the Guardian website, and this is, I believe this is the international edition, and this is the UK edition. So that's not a huge difference, perhaps, but it is a design system that has to convey the same sense of authority and the same quick access to information no matter what the number of stories are. And however often those stories change. If we look at France 24, this gets even harder when you start to deal with language. So maybe it's the same set of stories, but you have a totally different language set. So again, we're talking about a design system, not a fixed relationship. So this evolution of how we practice typography, we're not thinking about the size of the heading compared to how it overlays the image. We're thinking about the size of the heading no matter what the content is. It just needs to be more important than this other element following, which would be the body copy. And it doesn't matter if those specific sizes change, the relationship and that set of understanding of hierarchy is what needs to survive. So all of those things shift with varying breakpoints or varying content, but you still know what the most important piece of text is. So how do we move forward, I guess, is the most important thing for us to come away with. And that is, one, spending a little time looking at how you understand hierarchy in the printed things you see today. So look at, in a more abstract sense, how do you understand, looking at an ad, what is the most important piece of information? What is a secondary piece of information? What is that supplemental detail? And don't think about physical sizes, just think about relative sizes. So, and then think about voice, think about tone. So as a screen gets smaller and you have fewer and fewer elements on it, the only way you're going to convey voice and tone is through copy. It's going to be through the text, and it's through the physical embodiment of that text that gives you that sense of who this is. This really strong understanding just through the typeface that's used. The New Yorker magazine does a beautiful job of that. If you see a headline set in Irwin, which is their characteristic typeface, most of you, would know right away that that is from the New Yorker. This is an example of fonts.com. It's a website where you can get access to tens of thousands of typefaces and fonts to use online. We've got Typekit. It's another great source. WebType is another one. And then you've got Google Web Fonts. You've got MyFonts to buy licenses for self-hosted fonts. There's almost every vendor of type has some way for you to use it online. And so there's no excuse as a designer to work on something for a client and not be sure that the type that you're thinking about using is available for a reasonable cost and at a reasonable level of quality online. So that is the quickest way to have a universal design element that will survive across all of these different devices and environments and still preserve some of the meaning and intent of your design system, even when other elements need to go away. We have other technologies that have come along in that type. So open type features in English provide us with a lot of beautiful contextual letters and swashes and beautiful elements there. You can get real fractions. You can get nice ligatures connecting the C and the T up top. That's just in English. The open type features are supported in all WAF format fonts, which you can get from almost every vendor and will work in almost every device. One other thing to consider is if you are working in sites that are not in English language, those open type features, which are now so well supported, are actually essential for communicating accurately and clearly. There are critical marks, diacritics, that are part of a lot of other character sets, non-Western character sets, that are only accessible with open type. So it's only been very recently that you could use a nice typeface and get the benefit of all of these other characters in order to render something in Arabic properly, or render something in Japanese or Chinese properly. So that's pretty amazing. It does increase file sizes a little bit, but the good news is that there's WAF 2 that is becoming better and better supported. The support is 55–60% of devices now. But it's one that, like WAF and other formats, can all be served together, and the browser will choose and download the one that it understands. And most services are now serving WAF 2 in addition to WAF. If you're using Typekit or fonts.com or Google Web Fonts, most of them are adopting this as well. So using a service really gives you a great benefit there, because they're going to do the work of figuring out what the right file is to serve to any given device. So the reason I bring this up is, well, are most of you in the room designers? Some? Any? Wow, that's awesome. A design conference, and I managed to get a room full of people who aren't designers. All right, cool. Okay, so, well, this is, if you're not designers, front-end coders? Got a few. All right, so the reason I bring this up is that performance is a problem. Or more specifically, poor performance is a problem. And web fonts are getting a bad rap. They're getting a bad rap because most of the time when people implement them, they're kind of careless. They think it's pretty easy to just drop a line of CSS in there, and then you have a whopping blocker for getting all of your content on the page, because the browser vendors decided that it would be a really neat idea to withhold putting any content on the screen until the web font loads. So we went from, when web fonts first launched, bemoaning FOUT, or Flash of Unstyled Text, to FOIT, Flash of Invisible Text, which is not very well named, but that practice of the screen is blank for up to 3 seconds, sometimes more, depending on the version of the browser, waiting for that web font to load, oftentimes because you haven't been particularly careful about choosing high-quality web fonts. Well, FOUT was a feature, not a bug. FOUT was there so that the web, and its whole purpose in being, is get content to the end user. It would display that content in a fallback system font until the web font loaded, and then it would flip into that proper view. That is exactly what should happen. And you can make that happen by using things like the web font loader, and that gives you a class injected into the page that lets you scope your CSS so that you get a fallback font rather than the web font. then you can also tune that up to adjust the metrics of that, letter spacing, line height, font size, so that the fallback font, when it flips over into the web font, minimizes the change. I'm getting off on a little bit of a tangent, but I bring this up because it's so important for designers and developers to work together to minimize these disruptions in the user experience, because if you don't do that, then we get these fallbacks of the developers just saying, well, why don't we just not use web fonts? What's that adding to the experience? Well, it's adding everything to the experience, because on a small screen, it's the only thing that gets your design across. So it's really important that as designers, we speak up and say, hey, this isn't how type should be rendered. So we want better performance. We want smaller file size. We want the ability to subset fonts so that we only bring in the character set that we need for this particular site and audience, and get around or deal with the performance blockers. There are a couple other funny things that I had in here that I do want to get to before I've totally run out of time. But this is a little bit more from the London transport system. And so in thinking through your design, you'll notice that they've planned for different screen sizes. They've planned for headlines that are maybe 1, 2, or potentially even 3 lines, depending on the screen size. And they've adapted font size and line height across those different sizes. And that's a big part of some stuff that I've written about as well. In making the typography really responsive, you still get a clear understanding of what the most important piece of content is. It doesn't have to be quite as large physically as it is on the desktop, because it's competing with less information. On a small screen, you have fewer elements there. You don't have to shout quite so much and still get that same effect. So this is what I mean when I talk about the new typography. So we look at some stuff on the web now. This is a really beautiful website done for a conference in Bologna, Italy last year. And if you look at how they adapted that design for the small screen, they did a really wonderful job of maintaining the spirit and intent of the design, but they have tailored it for the context in which it's being viewed. And that's using media queries the same way you would use it throughout the rest of your responsive design. Here's another website done by Donnie Trong on the history of Vietnamese typography on the desktop and also on mobile. He's really done a beautiful job of adapting this. We see that people are doing a lot to create a fantastic reading experience on the web. And the bonus is that even some of those open type features that in this screenshot were not supported in the version of Safari that I made this in. Thankfully, I believe it happened about 3 days before I gave this talk in DrupalCon. They rolled out an update to Safari on iOS, and magically, it just started working. And that's the beauty of the web. He had the CSS coded correctly. It wasn't supported before. It is supported now. He changed nothing on his website, but because the browser updated, I got a better experience. So I made a new screenshot. That's the wonderful thing about the web, and that's why we deal with things like progressive enhancement and embrace those concepts. So we code things well, and we plan for the worst and best possible outcome, and as the web improves, so does the experience for the user. This is another website that I did carefully cut out the sidebar advertising that they have just destroyed this website with, but it's really kind of a bummer. But it's a beautiful website designed by Mule Studio, Mike Montero's company in San Francisco. One of the better editorial designs for a major newspaper that I've seen, it's the Seattle Times. And you can see that it reflows really well on a small screen. So they've really helped preserve some of the beauty of their editorial layout and adapted it for context very well. Another example of this, adapting from print to the web, this was an issue of Monotype's Recorder that I used to create a demo for a type workshop I gave last year. And you can see this had a lot of beautiful typefaces and layouts and photographs of these great old ghost signs on these old buildings. And I wanted to show that you can actually preserve that intent and that feeling in a website. So this is a screenshot from the HTML coded demo. And you can see that as this scrolls, I think I did a fairly good job of preserving that feeling. Using most of the same typefaces. I added a different serif on the left just so that we could show off the ligatures that aren't available in the other one. But then you can see it reflows really nicely onto a small screen as well. So you really can translate the quality and the interestingness of that experience from print onto the web, and then we can do one better by making it work on every device. So there is a good future here. And in case anybody's interested, rwt.io is my own website, and I have a whole bunch of code samples and resources there, as well as slides and videos from a bunch of other talks. So if you want to see some of the code and get some of these things to work with, you'll find a lot of stuff to play with there. It's rules and constraints that apply and adapt rather than bespoke prescribed relationships that allow these things to work. And that's how we have to change our thinking as designers. So, in closing, just to kind of wrap this up, because I know we started a little bit late, the thing that we want to keep in mind is, while some of you might stop and think, well, it's nice to have great typography, but I don't know if we have the budget, I don't know if the client's really going to go for it, we need to stop and think about how message will get across. We've been past the tipping point in physical books to ebooks for 5 years. It's been 5 years since Amazon started selling more ebooks than physical ones. So this is increasingly where it is. If we want to communicate well, and we want to design well and create an experience that will last for another 500 years, I don't know if our iPads will last that long, but the point is, this is it. Like, there will still be some print, but increasingly this is how people are consuming information. So if we want to get a message across, we need to accept that the way that message will get across is probably on someone's phone, probably on a crappy data connection, probably a low-end phone. Statistically, that's what we're thinking about. So in looking at these trends, Statista shows smartphone penetration in North America over 80%. And if you look at the demographics for age, it's even higher in the younger demographics. 50% of that younger demographic use it to access news, and 1 in 5 have no broadband access at all. So just how important is it for us to preserve that brand and message on devices in a performant way that will allow them access, when we know that the trend is the largest segment and fastest growing segment of the audience has no broadband, no landline, and no desktop computer? Oh, that's weird. Oh, sorry, that was my calendar kicking me out of the presentation. All right, so that's where it's going to be. That's how we have to design, because that's the only way people are going to see this message. This was a great quote from the general manager for Typekit, pointing out how much this has changed. So 2 election cycles, that's all we've had for the existence of web fonts. But if extrapolate from here, go back 2 more election cycles prior to that, and there was no iPhone. That's a massive shift. In four presidential terms, we have come from really not thinking about mobile at all, because we didn't own an iPhone and didn't have to that is where the bulk of news consumption happens. So thinking about the importance of this and the voice and how that gets across, we go back to Zach Leatherman, who is the ultimate single-issue voter, and wrote up a comparison of US presidential candidates and who has the best web font loading strategy. Using that prediction, Hillary Clinton will win. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. So why did she win? Well, she bought a custom typeface, which is pretty cool. Not everybody has the funds to do that, but they're self-hosting it, and they have really good performance. Now, I will point out that 8 seconds still seems like a really long time. You know what the culprit is? Optimizely. 5.5 seconds of render blocking JavaScript because they didn't implement that correctly. Also a fixable thing, as long as you are considering performance in the whole from the very beginning. So take that away, and they actually would have had readable content in about 2.5 seconds. Would have been really impressive. Async. They didn't put the word async in there for the JavaScript. That's what killed it. But you look at how some of the other candidates have done, and the issue is they are not really considering everything about the experience, whether or not they're using a distinct typeface. You know, Open Sans is like the new Helvetica. It's like everybody's using it. At least it's marginally more interesting, but if you want to get voice and tone and distinct across, you use a different typeface, and immediately you will stand out. If you don't implement it well, you'll have a 27-second load time. That's really why Ted Cruz is off the ballot. There's a whole lot of other reasons, but anyway. So the last thing, the only way you can actually make an impression and have a user experience is if your content actually gets there. So care about it, work with your partners, your designers, and your developer friends, make sure all of these things come together, use the best advice that's out there, and still get your tone across. Thank you very much. So the slides are already up on my website. Bit.ly link will take you right there. JP Dropcap D4D. If you're wondering, it's Choir Sans and Cardamom are the two typefaces that I used. That's my pal Tristan from a few days ago. He wouldn't get out of the reservoir. I just kind of sat there for about 10 minutes until he decided it was okay to come out. If you would like to get in touch with me, I work over at Isovera. You can reach me there, jpamental@isovera.com. If you are a Drupal developer or designer who would really like a new place to work, you should come and talk to me. It's my stump. I'm going to stand on it and talk. And a book, Responsive Typography, is available from O'Reilly. I've got some little cards with discount codes. If you're interested, come find me and enjoy the rest of your day.